To suggest that a person comes voluntarily to change his sexual orientation is to ignore the powerful environmental stress that has been telling him for years he should change. To grow up in a family where the word homosexual was whispered, to play in the playgrounds and hear the words faggot and queer, to go to church and hear of sin, and then to college and hear of illness, and finally to the counseling center that promises to cure, is hardly to create an environment of freedom and voluntary choice. What brings them into the counseling center is guilt, shame, and the loneliness that comes from their secret. I suggest you first desensitize them to their guilt. I think their choice would be more voluntary and free. Charles Silverstein, 1972.
Morning. Morning. Well, can you tell me what brings you in here?
Yeah, I was kind of having trouble, personal problems, you know.
I'd like to outline for you a kind of assessment procedure. If you should try to, say, masturbate to a female image, what do you think your reaction would be? What do you think would happen?
Nothing. It'd be like masturbating to the thought of a chair.
This is what I'd like you to try in the coming week, whenever you masturbate. I'd like you to just set a playmate picture, and I want you to stimulate yourself to masturbate with your homosexual image. And then at that point of inevitability, what I'd like you to try to do is just to switch your eyes, open your eyes and look at the picture, and focus on the picture visually and have your climax.
Yeah. Look, I came here to make a decision and to get myself moving in the right direction. This sounds like a game, and I just don't want to get involved with games. This is important to me.
Sure, I understand. But I look at it rather as a way of gathering some useful information, and I'd like you to try for just a week. And I'll see you next week at the same time.
Everything that I'd been doing was wrong. It was unethical, it was immoral, and it was really wrong. Well, I grew up in a lower middle class suburb of Boston called Dorchester, also in Roxbury, in the early 40s. Kind of a poor family in a Jewish ghetto part of the city. I was pretty much a Boston boy until I got out of college. I would say sometime at Harvard in my sophomore year is when I got interested in psychology. I didn't start out that way. I started out as a government major or poli-sci, and then I was a German lit major for a while. But I was always interested in people, in myself, what's going on with me. And I just sort of fell into the intro course at Harvard in my sophomore year. My main influence was reading Freud's introductory lectures that he gave at Clark University in the early 20th century. In the summer between my freshman and sophomore year, I worked the swing shift, the graveyard shift, at a ham factory. I was on an assembly line packing hams. And to fill the time in those early hours when there weren't many people around on the train, I read Freud's lectures. I found Freud's thinking irresistibly annoying.
I discovered some important new facts about the unconscious.
It was kind of, how can he say such things? Like if someone dreams of a train going into a tunnel, why does this mean something sexual with regard to the person's mother. How can he understand what people are really thinking and feeling on the basis of slips of the tongue or things that they say that don't have any obvious relevance to their psychological condition? And I found this really, really interesting, but I also, not understanding what his reasoning was, I attributed really more to myself than to him. I thought, well, I'm not really cut out for studying clinical psychology, but still it was fascinating, and it helped me. I think it played a role in my going to that first introductory course quite by accident in the fall of my sophomore year. Interestingly, at Harvard, there was very little discussion of behavior therapy at all. The emphasis there was really on Freud and variants of Freud.
By the time Freud visited Clark University in Massachusetts during the fall of 1909, he had written almost 40 publications, most notably The Interpretation of Dreams, and 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. Before reaching the States, he wrote to his close friend and fellow psychologist Carl Jung, stating, "When Americans discover the sexual core of our psychological theories, they will drop us." Instead, his words and theories intrigued the people in the audience, and psychoanalysis would become a regular practice in the United States through the 1970s.
Before Freud, there wasn't as much attention to psychopathology and what made people do the things they did and how to help them. He did not invent that, but he developed it more fully than anybody else. He really gave a tremendous impetus to this and generated an intellectual whirlwind of interest in Western Europe and then in this country. The essence of Freud, in my view, is the unconscious and repression, the notion that we unconsciously push out of our awareness things that are really troubling to us. And you may want to say, ironically, these are the things of most importance to the development of the human being. Before then, psychology was primarily a laboratory science. It started in the 19th century in Germany or in Leipzig in Poland. There really wasn't a field called clinical psychology actually until after World War II. People were beginning to criticize Freud in the 50s and the 60s on the basis that his explanations could not be experimentally validated, that psychoanalysis is not a very good science, and the structure and content of psychoanalytic theory and related theories makes it very hard to make clear predictions. Sometimes up is down and sometimes up is up. What you say you're afraid of is not really what you're afraid of. This is what began to bother people a great deal, in particular Hans Eysenck in England and Joseph Wolpe in South Africa. They were developing this field they called behavior therapy, later became called cognitive behavior therapy, where the emphasis was not to infer unconscious motivation, but to try to deal with things more or less at the conscious level. When I went to graduate school at Stanford, this is what I encountered. In the fall of my second year in 1963, Arnold Lazarus from South Africa happened to come to Stanford, and he was perhaps the most famous practicing behavior therapist in the world. I spent most of my second year sitting in with him while he was seeing patients and watching what we call a master clinician deal with patients and work with patients, seeing things in action.
Let's assume that I said to you, you could just use one word to describe whatever is bothering you. What would that word be? Take your time to think, but you just allowed one word. What would that be?
Thought of it already. Closed.
Closed.
Yeah.
To say that that enriched my perspective is an understatement. I suddenly saw the challenges of applying behavior therapy and experimental principles to trying to deal with a suffering human being.
Can you give me one sentence with closed in it that'll really reflect the feelings?
I have chosen to lead a closed-off life.
The kind of people Lazarus was treating were really the kind that I began treating when I began as a licensed psychologist myself. Namely, the folks who are anxious and depressed. These are people who are coping with life but are really unhappy about it. These people who are beyond sad. They're really sad. They're very unhappy. They see no hope for the future. They are sometimes suicidal. Their functioning is very marginal. Lazarus taught me desensitization, taught me other ways of helping people expose themselves to things that they are very much afraid of. But the emphasis was really on what can we do right now to help the people move forward, rather than doing an historical archaeological dig, which was a way to think about what Freud and the Freudians have been preoccupied with, and still are to a very large degree.
In the late 40s and early 50s, experimental methods such as ice pick lobotomies, hormonal injections, and the use of psychedelics gained popularity as methods to influence sexual orientation. By the late 1960s, the best-known treatment was electroshock therapy. Professionals believed they could decrease homosexual desires by administering an electric shock to a patient when shown a pornographic image of the same sex. Homosexual women also suffered the full range of conversion efforts, from hormonal shock therapy to genital mutilation. But since more societal importance was placed on fixing gay men's so-called lack of masculinity, women's sexual desires and needs were largely ignored.
Aversion therapy you can think of as attaching negative feelings to things that have positive value for people and they don't want it to. Sometimes the aversion is induced by electrodes. Sometimes it's induced by very disgusting imagery in a technique called covert sensitization. And sometimes it's induced by actually injecting a nausea-inducing medication. I think it's called apomorphine. M.P. Feldman wrote a book sometime in the early 60s on aversion therapy, and he and a man named McCulloch were very well known, and he came to show a 16mm film showing gay men being shocked while they're looking at pictures of men. I was in the audience, and I was kind of his host. In fact, I have a vivid memory. We couldn't find a good place to put the movie projector. I remember literally holding the 16mm movie projector in my lap so I could show it on the screen. And I watched this film, and I thought, gosh, that's really awful. Those poor patients. He genuinely believed that this was the best way to help people get better. I never criticized him as a person or his motivations, but what he did, I certainly took issue with. For one thing, I should make clear, I've never shocked a patient. I've never literally applied electrodes or shocked them. And this happened, I would say, in the late 60s, and it began helping me to rethink, is this really the route that we should be going?
One's own decision as to what one should do in regard to one's own life must take into account a great deal more than the scientific data that bear on the subject.
I had also been reading in the literature on the development of human sexuality and reading, among other things, the Kinsey reports.
Homosexuality was thought to be a comparatively rare phenomenon until Kinsey came along and provided very good evidence that actually there were, of course, roughly 20 million gay men and women. And that was important. They, for the first time, realized that they were not a tiny minority, but actually a very sizable proportion of the population.
In the Kinsey reports, they talked a lot about the pairing of sexual arousal with certain kinds of stimuli, if you will, to endow these stimuli with positive sexual properties. This helped me move towards the so-called Playboy therapy, or orgasmic reorientation treatment, sometimes it's called. The story of orgasmic reorientation has a lot to do with the Playboy Forum.
By the time Jerry arrived at Stony Brook, Playboy had established itself as one of the most progressive magazines in the country. Hugh Hefner was amazed by Kinsey's report describing men's sexuality and the finding that 35% of men had experienced orgasm from a homosexual encounter. From that, Hefner wanted to question the thinking of old morality. He began writing monthly essays on issues including capitalism, religion, and the history of sex. These essays eventually became known as the Playboy Forum. In the forum, some of the first open discussions of homosexuality occurred in America. While the photos of naked women were the main selling point, the majority of pages were filled with articles and advertisements, allowing the American public to both observe and interact with new perspectives and ideas. A perfect place for Jerry to introduce his therapy.
In the Playboy Forum were sort of letters to the editor. People were writing in, seeking help for their homosexuality, other sexual problems they had, and they were not being given very encouraging information as to how these things could be changed. I wrote a letter to the Playboy Forum and told them that there's the new development that can be very effective in helping gay people change. It created a heated, rather lively exchanges among readers in the Playboy Forum. Many of the letters published in your forum relate to sexual deviations. Judging from the advice usually given, it is probable that your staff is unaware of new therapeutic methods. I began to kind of tie it together in thinking that since I didn't want to do the aversion thing, I would use Playboy photographs as material, if you will, that gay men could use at home to focus on while they were getting aroused by their deviant stimuli, and then literally moving their eyes towards the scantily clad women. And that came to be called Playboy therapy.
It was a good try.
But the most important factor for my change of heart was Charles Silverstein.
I'm Dr. Charles Silverstein. I'm a psychologist in practice in New York City. Born and raised in Brooklyn. It was more or less average childhood of a kid growing up in a working class family. My father drove a truck for a living. He worked delivering newspapers at night. I was intrigued with a kind of mystic aura that existed about being a therapist. At the time, psychoanalysis was the predominant field in psychotherapy. We studied Freud Talmudically, going from paper to paper, arguing about word after word. And I concluded after doing all of that this was a bunch of horseshit. We chose the person to demonstrate against based upon deadlines of newspapers. So you have to be very smart about this. No one knows that a demonstration went on if it doesn't get into the media. We're very good about that.
I think it was in the October 72 or so.
At the Hilton.
And Chuck had attended a meeting of the Association for Advancement of Behavior Therapy.
I had suggested to the Gay Activist Alliance in New York, a radical gay organization, that we zap, that was the term we used for demonstration, that we zap the convention because psychologists and psychiatrists are making presentations about their use of aversion therapy to cure gay men. We thought that a rather heinous thing to do. I looked at it as sadomasochistic behavior. The results always showed that there were no cures, but that didn't stop people from publishing more papers about it. There were a number of presentations that day. There was a fellow by the name of Dr. Quinn, who had just come from Ireland. And I introduced myself as both a psychologist and a gay liberationist. And I said, look, there are a bunch of us in the audience, and we're here to demonstrate against you. And we hope that you will not interfere with our doing it, because it's going to happen. So don't make a fuss. There's not going to be any violence. We're just going to talk. And I said, well, you have 10 minutes. And at the end of 10 minutes, we're going to. I put it in that way because I have found that when you put in that context and you don't threaten violence, that professionals fold up instantly, and he did. He said, oh, okay. And so he talked, and at 10 minutes, one of our officers, Ron Gold, got up and said, now we're taking over.
While Silverstein's demonstrations remained peaceful, the growing tension would soon reach a tipping point. In Los Angeles, on New Year's Day, 1967, police officers beat and arrested 14 patrons over same-sex kissing at a bar called the Black Cat. On June 28, 1969, police raided the Stonewall Inn, a gay club located in New York City. Resistance to the police brutality erupted into a full-blown riot, led in large part by members of the trans community. For the next 6 days, thousands of protesters gathered in solidarity to fight for their rights. The Stonewall Uprising brought national attention to the gay liberation movement. Around the same time, activist Frank Kameny, who had been fired from the U.S. Army Map Service for his sexual orientation, coined the slogan "Gay is Good," shining a light on workplace and housing discrimination across the country. But still, gay men continued to volunteer for therapy in large numbers, thankful for the opportunity to be made what society deemed normal.
Here in the early 70s, it was absolutely mainstream to help gays change. Absolutely mainstream. And Chuck came to a workshop that I was giving one morning on what I regarded as new ways and more humane ways to help gays change. I remember he sat down front to my left. I remember I can visualize it. A very pleasant fellow, smiled a lot, very polite.
At the time, I was a graduate student in psychology at Rutgers University. I was also a member of AABT. I had helped to organize this demonstration, but I also wanted to meet Jerry Davison because Jerry had been doing some work. He had his Playboy therapy in trying to cure someone of sadomasochistic fantasies. I think if Jerry wanted to write that up today, he would write it up differently than he did. He said, who the hell cares?
I was one of the good guys. I was the non-aversion sexual reorientation behavior therapist.
It was a different approach. It was not punishing people, which is what the aversion therapist did. And I thought that he understood that punishment was not a good way of helping people with anything. In that sense, he had broken from the pack. And so this is someone I could talk to. And I did, and he listened. And we started talking. We haven't stopped talking. Jerry made his presentation to a group of people, and afterwards I went up to him to meet him and want to engage him in some schmoozing. And as I walked up, he immediately said to me, I know who you are.
He has some flyers, and the flyers advertised a symposium that he was going to chair on Sunday, the last day of the convention. And he said, would you mind if I handed this out to the workshop participants? They might be interested in this symposium, and maybe you take one for yourself. Maybe you'd like to come. And I looked at the flyer. My reaction was, oh, it's going to be one of these radical gays, and they give us trouble. They're going to zap us. It was literally people standing up and yelling at you while you're talking, swearing at you, calling you a Nazi, a fascist, a terrible person. Happened to me a fair amount. That's what zapping was, and it was very much in the air. Remember, this was the early 70s, people taking political action, but they were doing it very much so in professional settings. So when Chuck showed me this brochure, I said, of course you can hand it out. Frankly, I didn't think I had much choice. I thought he was going to do it anyway. But he was such a polite, pleasant guy. I figured, oh, what the hell? And I stuffed one in my pocket. And on Sunday, I had packed up my stuff and was on my way to leave the hotel. It was the New York Hilton, to go down to Penn Station, catch the Long Island Railroad, back out to Stony Brook and Port Jefferson, where I live. Knowing a lot of people in the association, I kept running into old friends and chatting. And before I knew it, I looked at my watch and I said, I'll never make it to Penn Station. I think I'll just hang around the hotel. And this, I think, a very fateful event. I'm not a believer in fate too much, but I reached into my pocket and I found this brochure. Oh, Silverstein gave me this brochure. I'll go to his symposium, which I did. And what it was a large lecture hall, ballroom. There were probably a few hundred people there, and it was very ruckus, a big ruckus. And there was Chuck, who was chairing the symposium, and he was being zapped by his brothers and sisters in the movement, if you will. And I thought, wow, if they're zapping him, God knows what they do to me. And what he was saying was that these behavior therapists, they need to stop what they're doing, or they need to modify what they're doing, because what they're doing is really not good.
To suggest that a person comes voluntarily to change his sexual orientation is to ignore the powerful environmental stress, oppression, if you will, that has been telling him for years that he should change. To grow up in the family where the word homosexual was whispered, to play in the playgrounds and hear the words faggot and queer, to go to church and hear of sin, and then to college and hear of illness, and finally to the counseling center that promises to cure, is hardly to create an environment of freedom and voluntary choice. What brings them into the counseling center is guilt, shame, and the loneliness that comes from their secret. If you really wish to help them freely choose, I suggest you first desensitize them to their guilt. After that, let them choose, but not before. I don't know any more than you what would happen, but I think their choice would be more voluntary and free than it is at present. Yes, those are my words.
Can you tell me what your feelings are about homosexuality?
I think they should be shot if you ask me.
When you're up in the front trying to do your job and you find you got a fruit beside you, it's not the greatest.
Do you know any people who are homosexual?
No, thank heaven.
Gay people were taught that they were horrible, that they were shameful, that they belonged in jail. And when you teach people that, they want to change, and they go to the psychoanalyst to be changed. And the psychoanalysts were making money off people feeling shame about their sexual behavior.
I was stunned. I literally do not remember the rest of the symposium. I left soon after that to get down to Penn Station. I remember getting on the train, and I remember sitting, looking out the window, and just thinking.
To grow up in a family where the word homosexual was whispered, to play in the playgrounds and hear the words faggot.
If there's such a thing as an intellectual, emotional epiphany, that's what I had. The following day, I went to school, and I just sought people out. I had to tell people about this. Most of them were very upset by my change of heart. How can you say you're wrong? You've made important contributions. You've helped so many people. I said, I don't think so. And I found in general, the graduate students were much more open to we shouldn't try to change them than my faculty friends. So I began teaching on this, and I began to develop an argument that I believe moved a little bit further even than Chuck's. But when he talked about we should desensitize gay people to their guilt that's been inflicted on them, and then they'll be more free to choose. I took the position that no, their negative reactions are a function of society, and I will not help them change. I will not desensitize them to their guilt. But that's separate from whether I should be doing it. And I can harken back to my readings earlier of the two Kinsey reports. Kinsey was very liberal in his view of the development of human sexuality, and he saw that conditioning had a lot to do with it. He took a non-judgmental view of human sexuality, and this was in the 40s and 50s. So I began to think more and more about, no, because of the social context, that's where our efforts should be directed. Now, how can I best help my colleagues, starting with them first, begin to think about the social and psychological implications are of what they're doing? Well, the way to do it is to cut off that avenue of intervention. We're not going to do that anymore. And that's what caught people's attention.
Freudians were not allowed to consider contributions from other areas of science and even history. And they remained narrow-minded about all issues. Here in the United States, we got what was called the phobic theory of homosexuality. That would be in the 30s, the 1930s. An analyst by the name of Rado at Columbia. And he had some students. Of the most famous students was Socarides, Hatterer, and Bieber. They continued this theory of homosexuality being a reaction to what was called the vagina dentata. A man who's gay is gay because he's afraid of the teeth in the vagina of a woman. Gobble him up. Now, of course, every gay man says, why do I always want a blowjob? It didn't make any sense. But the point is, it was theory that drove all practice, instead of learning about the behavior of people like gay men. They knew nothing about the behavior of gay men. It came to the point whenever some radio program or television program would have one of these debates about whether homosexuality is normal or abnormal, the only psychiatrist they could get to argue that the homosexuals were sick was Socarides. He was the only one left because he was sort of a bull in a china shop.
Doctor, according to this book, the American Psychiatric Association Manual of Mental Disorder, homosexuality is a mental illness, a mental disorder. Is that justified?
Yes, I think so. You notice in that manual, we talk about disorders, and disorders are much more than strict illnesses, but they're illnesses just as much because they involve a failure of functioning.
I've had many debates with that asshole.
Charles Socarides was a well-known psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, who took the usual Freudian view that by definition homosexuality is sick and they have to be changed.
Homosexuality is in fact a mental illness which has reached epidemiological proportions.
For homosexuality, it militates against the family, and it produces individuals who care very little about their role in a particular family.
A man is either first as a male or a female, or he's an intersex, and we're not talking about intersexes. A man must be a man, and a woman must be a woman.
One of the things he didn't say there that he usually does say is homosexuals are so damaged that they cannot get into long-lasting love relationships.
Most homosexuals must seek and strive and look for numerous partners in order to try and find themselves or replicas of themselves.
I was on a program where he repeated that. And I said, well, tell me, Dr. Socarides, how many wives have you had? I knew the answer. And he said, that is personal, and I don't discuss that here. And I said, you've had 3 wives, and I've only had 1 lover. How do you explain that? And wouldn't touch it. Wouldn't touch it.
a homosexual that is an exclusive homosexual, and there are various types of homosexual, the homosexual behavior, which is not true homosexuality, is a person who out of inner necessity must engage in homosexual relations, otherwise he experiences a great deal of anxiety. He's a product, really, of a process of very, very bad child rearing practices, which have caused certain difficulties in his own sense of identity, certain types of anxieties, and certain other inner conflicts, which make him, on many occasions, have an equilibrium which is quite unstable.
Socarides was only one example of a psychiatrist pushing a false narrative, void of any reputable scientific proof. Other damning publications arose from authors such as Edmund Bergler, Lawrence Hatterer, and Irving Bieber, who believed that homosexuality was undoubtedly tied to a mother's overbearing relationship with her son. In response to these theorists, Evelyn Hooker, a scientist and psychologist, sought to prove that there was, in fact, no pathological difference between homosexuals and heterosexuals by using the Rorschach test, among other psychological exams. She enrolled 60 anonymous individuals, 30 straight men and 30 gay men who were similar in age and IQ. After removing herself from the study, she employed several of the best Rorschach readers to blindly calculate the results. Not only were the findings between the two groups extremely similar, the judges were unable to distinguish the gay men from the straight men. Hooker concluded that homosexuality as a clinical entity simply does not exist, as its forms are as varied just as much as those of heterosexuality. Although Hooker's findings were crucial, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual still listed homosexuality as a mental disorder for years to come.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual allowed mental health professionals to diagnose gay people as sick. It was listed as a perversion, sexual deviation, paraphilia.
You didn't want to be viewed as having a paraphilia. It's not a normal thing to have.
There was a whole idea that lust created a deterioration of the brain. There's an interaction, they said. And certainly, if you're going to be lustful, have intercourse, it should only be for the purpose of reproduction. Having sexual intercourse with your wife was acceptable once a month. That wouldn't be dangerous, but if you did it a lot, you would get crazy. You'd end up in an institution. And certainly something like homosexuality, where you waste your seed, and they used to call it vital fluids, that you masturbate and you ejaculate, that your vital fluids would be spent, and that would cause the brain to deteriorate. So it had a medical contribution as well, and a lot more that I would bore you to death if I talked to you about. Masturbation per se was listed as a disorder, I think, until 1942. If you let these guys have their way, sex would be a mental disorder. Sex has a bad reputation. The practitioners of psychotherapy are ill-trained about sex. They don't know anything about it. They go through doctoral programs. They don't take a course, one course, not one, in human sexuality. So they get their PhDs and come out with no more knowledge than their own limited experiences.
What would be the effect of changing the nomenclature and simply saying that homosexuality is another form of normal behavior?
In the first place, if you do normalize it in quotes, you will produce a situation in which men and women will fly away from each other even more than now, and we know that's already a difficult problem. The one hurt the most.
So when the psychiatrists were going to eliminate homosexuality, they were hurting the pocketbooks of the analysts who were out to keep gay people in therapy because it enriched them. And when we in Gay Liberation fought to eliminate homosexuality as a mental disorder, we had in mind the pocketbooks of all these people making money off others feeling shameful and horrible about their lives.
Now, Chuck, we became good friends in the early 70s. And as I was developing what would be my presidential address for AABT, we had dinner out in Port Jefferson. And I told him what I was thinking of saying, based very heavily on what he had said a couple years earlier. And he said, "That's terrific." He liked it, but then he cautioned me as a friend.
I said, "Jerry, it's a great idea, and I'd be very proud for you to say those things because they're true, but you're going to pay a price. You're going to find colleagues who say, I wonder why he's on their side. Maybe he's a closet one of them." And people are going to whisper to each other.
So I said, well, number one, I don't happen to be gay, but it wouldn't bother me if people thought I was.
I said, you lose friends. So be prepared to pay the price.
I'll take my chances. I think I can develop a good enough logical argument that will be steeped in philosophy and sociology and politics. People will see me not as a kook, but as someone who's thought carefully about this.
So he listened to me and he said, I don't care. This is the right thing to do.
I continued to develop my presidential address, which I ended up giving in November of 1974.
He knew more than that it was the right thing to do. He had the balls to do it. There were lots of people in AABT who knew it was the right thing to do, but they wouldn't do it.
I wish today to voice some concerns I have been wrestling with for some years concerning the way behavior therapists, and for that matter all other therapists, have been approaching homosexuality. As Silverstein put it at the AABT convention 2 years ago in a discussion of male homosexuality, and let me quote, "To suggest that a person comes voluntarily to change his sexual orientation is to ignore the powerful environmental stress, oppression if you will, that has been telling him for years that he should change."
I was, in a way, felt embarrassed that he used my words, and also prideful at the same time. I remember writing those words, sitting at my desk in my old typewriter, clunky typewriter. My lover, William, just a few feet away from me. And I remember thinking to myself, this is a good paragraph. That it had the emotional appeal I wanted it to. And to hear Jerry say those words out loud, I was embarrassed because they were so good, and he read it so well, and he showed that respect in me to speak them in front of the whole convention.
Continuing the quote from Silverstein, what brings them into the counseling center is guilt, shame, and the loneliness that comes from their secret. In other words, Silverstein suggests that we must go back into the causal network and ask ourselves, as determinists, what are the determinants of the client asserting to you that he or she wants to change? Well, I got to the point that, therefore, we should stop offering change of orientation, even if people request it. My recollection is that the room got really quiet. The room about 1,000 people. Even if we could effect certain changes, there is still the more important question of whether we should. I believe we should not. You have to understand, I was very nervous at the time. I tape recorded the speech mostly because I wanted to be able to hear it afterwards and hear what I said, even though I did have a script. When the speech got over and people applauded, I don't know how enthusiastic were. They were polite. A number of people came down to the front, and both men and women. And what I remember is them tearfully saying something to the effect, "I don't believe what I just heard. thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope this makes a difference. Thank you, thank you. When I left the room, there was a reception area outside of the ballroom, and I remember walking into the reception area, people drinking and having canapes or whatever. And what I remember was that I kind of, as I walked in, people backed away, sort of like Moses parting the Red Sea. It's a little grandiose, but people backed away, and they seemed embarrassed. And then one person came over, one of my colleagues, whom I won't name. He came over and he kissed me on the cheek. And I knew exactly what he was doing. And I basically uttered a profanity to him. And I remember that pretty vividly. And then people talked, and I don't remember exactly what happened after that. I was naturally emotionally drained because I had been working up to this for the better part of a year. And my vindication for this, of course, is that 45 years later, a number of states have passed laws against doing conversion therapy.
On March 2nd, 2020, Virginia became the 20th state in America to ban conversion therapy for minors. The majority of the country, however, still allows for children to receive the therapy, mainly in the form of religious counseling and Christian sleepaway camps intended to save children from their same-sex desires. Although Title VII had prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin since 1964, it did not prohibit discrimination based on gender or sexuality until June 15, 2020. The aftermath of Jerry's speech in 1974 prompted support and backlash, both of which contributed to the positive change that would follow.
My efforts to publish my speech were really interesting. I made some revisions and I sent it in to the American Psychologist, which is one of the publications that every member of APA gets. I got a letter back from the editor saying, I'm not sending this out for review, I'm rejecting it because it's not of enough general interest to the membership. And my reaction was, of not general enough interest? I don't think so. But I didn't appeal it, I didn't make a fuss. I sent it to the leading clinical journal. It was edited by a man named Brendan Marr. And he said, Jerry, I'm not gonna send it out for review. And I thought to myself, oh, not again. He said, because I think it's so important that I'm gonna accept it. And I was just very happy. Then he said, but I'd like to invite 3 critiques. Would you be okay with that? And of course, my reaction was, okay, I'd love that. Because there's nothing better than having your paper critiqued. Because it's a signal that it's important. One of the people who critiqued it was, in my recollection, I believe it was Socarides, and it's predictably very damning. And I think that even calling it dangerous, what I was saying. I mean, it was extremely negative, and I wasn't surprised by it. Brendan Marr got another manuscript from a couple of colleagues of mine at University of Georgia who critiqued the paper. And the basis of their critique was, there are ways to change orientation. And would you write a critique of their critique? And I said, sure. The title of the article was, Not Can, But Ought. It is one thing to say that one should not treat homosexuality. It is quite another thing to suggest that one should not treat homosexuals. My colleagues were arguing, you really can do it if you just try harder. And I was saying, no, that's beside the point. There are a lot of things we can do that we shouldn't do. Even that general halfway measure of you're not sick, that is not widely accepted. We like to think that it is, but I don't believe in most parts of the country that it is widely accepted. It's accepted on the Northeast and on the West Coast.
The people in the city are a little more accepting to the gay life in San Francisco.
There's not as much police patrol. They don't pick people up in the street. They don't raid the bars as frequently in San Francisco as they do in other areas of the United States.
Things for gay people in places like LA, New York, Chicago, Miami, things are pretty good. The fact of the matter is, homosexuality is still dangerous in many places of the United States.
One of the effects, I believe, that this getting away from sexual orientation treatment when you're consulted by an openly gay person is that there are a whole host of other problems that you can work on. It's not as if being gay means you're a paragon of mental health any more than being straight. You're people who have problems. And when this salient characteristic is people who happen to be gay have these problems, or people have these problems, footnote that may be gay or may not be gay, becomes less of an issue.
And why did the psychiatrists eliminate homosexuality? Most of them had nothing against gay people. Professional associations are basically political groups, and they change according to the waves of politics that go on. And they change the same way our society changes, and that's because something about the old way no longer works. And they came to the conclusion that damning homosexuality no longer works. We had, at that point, had a women's movement. We had a black movement. And only lastly did we have the gay movement. And they had to go along with the politics of the time. And that's why they eliminated homosexuality.
I believe that for the most part, this, if you will, battle that gays have been waging, and we've made a great deal of progress, I believe we're way far from the goal. This is ingrained in all Orthodox religions, all of them.
Scientific communities were accepting homosexuality, and they were saying that it's not a disorder anymore. Christians have to fight the battle. Christians have to fight this battle of homosexual sin because the professional counseling community won't do it anymore.
I remember when I was on a book tour many years ago, with a book of mine, and I happened to be there on a Sunday, and all the television programs were church services, all of them, for the whole day.
Homosexuality is one of those that could be coupled with murder and other sins, but it would be the government who would be executing the homosexual.
These are, I think, live issues still for our society, and I always caution people about that.
We are saying, okay, we are gay, and we're telling everyone about it. We're making ourselves known. We're coming out of the closets, quote unquote, and we're not hiding anymore.
It's a very complex thing and a very powerful thing, just being honest and open around your friends.
I want to be accepted as a human being. Say if I want to walk down the street with my arm around my lover, I do it still feeling that maybe people are looking at me and thinking, oh, look at that queer.
Today, gay people in big centers are out, they're open, their families know. But in those days, if you were exposed as homosexual, all sorts of things could happen. Some who were caught committed suicide. I have a friend who, at the age of 16, he came out to his parents and his father threw him out of the house right then and there with only the clothes on his back. That story was repeated a number of times by a number of gay men and lesbians.
What is a homosexual? Is he or she a person who has simply chosen an alternate sexual life, or a mentally sick person who, like any other, should be treated by whatever resources the psychiatric profession has? That question, that debate, has generated a small civil war in the psychiatric establishment.
60 Minutes did a program on nomenclature change and wanted to interview me. Now we're talking December, January of 73, 74. And they were coming over the same day that my mother was coming up from Florida. She arrived, and being the Jewish mother she was, she insisted on doing my laundry, which of course I didn't want her to do because I had something to talk to her about. Finally, when she did my laundry and she came back and settled down, I told her that the 60 Minutes crew was coming over. And she asked why, and I told her about doing this program on homosexuality, and she said, well, why are you going to interview you? She still didn't have a clue. And I said, because I'm gay, I'm homosexual. And she got all upset, and then the door opens, and the camera crew arrived early. See? And they brought in cameras which are bigger. In those days, they were bigger than the cameras we have now. And giant cables and lights and all, while she's sitting there. And she went bonkers. And she said, well, if that's the case, I'm leaving here and going to visit your brother instead, much to the chagrin of my brother. And that's how I came out to my mother.
Charles Silverstein led the fight to remove homosexuality from the diagnostic manual. He appeared before the association's nomenclature committee to argue that inherently homosexuals are no more disturbed than heterosexuals. We spoke with Silverstein and with Ronald Gold, the spokesman for the Gay Activist Alliance of New York.
If you want to call me a deviant, you can. If you want to say I'm immoral, you can. But there's a very important difference between saying I'm immoral and saying I'm sick.
We both had some choice things to say about some figures and about psychoanalysis. I think by and large it's been a very destructive force in a lot of ways in our field, but particularly with regard to issues of sexuality, not just homosexuality, but all issues of all sorts of sexuality.
I had argued some years ago that eliminating homosexuality as a mental disorder should bring down the whole house of cards of using societal morality as the basis of diagnosis. And I said that all of the paraphilias should also be eliminated. The paraphilias are kinky sex. And in the last edition of DSM, what they did, they said that if you have a paraphilia, you're into feet, let's say, or leather, or you want to do strange things with another person, it could only be diagnosed if you were unhappy about it. But if you were pleased about it, it couldn't be diagnosed. While that's a stupid solution, it does represent an advance because professional organizations move at a snail's pace, you see. And so I would expect that a later edition will be eliminated completely.
Since 1979, Jerry has been a professor of psychology at the University of Southern California. Through his research, teaching, and scholarly publications, he has continued to argue against conversion therapies. His arguments have emphasized the often unexamined values and biases that therapists inevitably impose on all of their patients, not just those who happen to be gay. To use the phrase of one of his mentors, Perry London, therapists, whether they like it or not, are society's secular priests. They play a significant role in guiding patients to a life worth living. As for Charles, he founded 2 LGBTQ counseling centers, the Journal of Homosexuality, and published 8 books about LGBTQ people and the treatment of their problems without prejudice. He now gives workshops on human sexuality for the New York State Psychological Association and has a small private practice in New York City. He is a frequent commentator on the medical and psychological bias against people who practice kinky sex, but is most well known for his contribution of eliminating homosexuality as a mental disorder.
To suggest that a person comes voluntarily to change his sexual orientation is to ignore the powerful environmental stress, oppression, if you will, that has been telling him for years that he should change. Even if we could effect certain changes, there is still the more important question of whether we should. I believe we should not.
you.